Welcome to the latest installment of Don't Take This as Gospel. I'm Mike Partika, and we're covering Dennis Prager's The Rational Bible, Exodus, God, Slavery, and Freedom. Please pick up a copy at the affiliate link in the video description. We're looking at the Eighth Commandment, Thou shalt not steal. And Dennis Prager writes, the Eighth Commandment, do not steal, is unique in that it is completely open-ended. It's the only completely open-ended commandment. All the other commandments are specific. The fifth commandment says you should honor your parents, so it's specific to your parents. The sixth commandment against murder is only about taking the life of an innocent human being, so it doesn't apply to executions, for example. The seventh commandment, prohibiting adultery, is specific to married persons. And the commandment against stealing is completely open-ended. There is absolutely nothing that it is okay to steal. And what's interesting about that is that, therefore, it's wrong to steal human beings. And that would be, we translate that today as kidnapping. And there's actually a specific commandment in the book of Exodus that talks about kidnapping, and kidnapping is a death penalty offense. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that Dennis Prager relates this to the institution of slavery as it was practiced throughout Europe and in the Americas. He says, no one with even an elementary understanding of the Eighth Commandment could ever use the Bible to justify the most common manner by which people became enslaved, kidnapping. Kidnapping people and selling them into slavery, as was done to Africans and others throughout history, is forbidden by the Eighth Commandment. Critics of the Bible who argue that the Bible allowed such slavery, and defenders of such slavery who used the Bible, were both wrong. And lest there be any confusion about this issue, the very next chapter of the Torah specifies a person who kidnaps another, particularly when done with the intention of selling the victim into slavery, shall be put to death. That's Exodus 21:16. Now, what's interesting about this is that, yes, it absolutely does prohibit the kind of enslavement that was done to Africans. If anybody's ever watched the series Roots, you would see an example of that where the main character goes off to, let's see, what is the story? He goes off to he goes off to cut some wood so that he can make a drum. And when he does, he is captured by slavers and then taken to America. So that kind of slavery is absolutely forbidden in the Bible. Now, that's not to say that slavery itself is forbidden in the Bible, because there are more ways than just that a person can become a slave. In those days, what were some of the other cases? Well, number one, you could sell yourself into slavery. Let's say that, all of your business options failed, there were no jobs around to be had, the only thing that you could do in order to survive was to sell yourself into slavery. That was an option back then. And to be honest, I think that's one of the reasons why even in the New Testament, slavery is not forbidden. And I tend to think it's because it leaves the door open so that just in case there is a massive depression or something and the whole economy collapses, and the only way that people are going to be able to live, even at a subsistence level, is to be slaves to someone else who has the resources, then that's an open option. What's another way that you could be enslaved? Well, you could be sentenced to slavery by a court. That was another way of becoming enslaved back in the day. Maybe you had debts that you couldn't pay, so you wound up becoming enslaved to the person whom you were indebted, or maybe somebody else paid off your debt and you became that person's slave. That was another way. Another way was to be born into slavery. If you were the child of slaves, then you generally inherited the slave status of your parents. And one other way was if you were taken as a prisoner of war. If you were taken as a captive during wartime, then you could wind up a slave that way. So there were multiple ways of becoming a slave in Old Testament times. And this was common throughout the world. I mean, it's not like the Old Testament instituted slavery. And that's something that I don't think people understand very much. People look at the world around them and you might recall that I've got a video that I just put out on don't judge people, past people by present day standards. We tend to look at the world around us and see and think that this is the way things have always been. This is the way life has always been. Slavery, there's no slavery. That's not the default existence. The default existence is freedom, and then it's just an aberration whenever slavery happened. That's not really true. Back in ancient times, just about every people of one sort or another on every continent practiced slavery, practiced some kind of slavery. And so the idea that slavery is just, like a uniquely American or uniquely European aberration, I mean, that's false. That's even false today, because the most glaring example of slavery in the modern world happened in Libya, in Muslim Libya, where Gaddafi got overthrown. And then all of a sudden, you've got people who are being sold on auction blocks. So slavery, I mean, freedom has really been, liberty has really been the aberration in human history. And I'm not saying that liberty is not the way it should be, far from it. We've enjoyed an immense amount of prosperity on account of the fact that we all have to work for a living now. And we've got this economy where goods and services are flowing at a rapid rate, and that gives us the standard of living we have today, which we didn't have when we had slave times. A lot of that can also be owed to the Industrial Revolution, which has saved a lot of labor and made slavery, not as much a benefit to some people. But, you've got the competition between labor and capital and all that kind of stuff. So we've got economic challenges that still exist to this day. But the point being is that we're in a pretty unique period in human history where slavery is pretty much abolished throughout the world, with some areas still practicing it, but not nearly as prominently as it used to be. It used to be ubiquitous. And the Bible reflects that. The Bible reflects the fact that slavery was a very, very common practice in the ancient world. And, we're reading the book of Exodus. What were the entire Israelite people? They were slaves. They were slaves in Egypt. And then God liberated them from Egypt and, brought them into the Promised Land. So slavery was a very, very common theme, and it's a common theme that runs into the New Testament as well. You'll note that in the Greek, whenever you see the word servants of Jesus Christ, oftentimes the word is actually translated slaves of Jesus Christ. You were bought with a price. That's an interesting phrase. You were bought with a price. You were purchased with his blood, and therefore you're his slave. That was a real line of thought in the New Testament. And there's also talk of, who you make yourself a slave to. Do you make yourself a slave to righteousness, or do you make a slave to sin? Because you're going to make yourself a slave to somebody. You're always working for somebody. Who's it going to be? So that's another common theme. Another place where slavery has a common theme, and I think it relates some to this prohibition against kidnapping. I can't help but notice that in the Constitution, in the original Constitution, this is before any amendments that barred slavery. That didn't happen until almost 100 years after the Constitution was written. The Constitution of the United States did provide for slavery. But one of the provisions that it had, and I don't know how many people know this, is that the slave trade, where you could purchase slaves from overseas. People would bring slaves that they had captured to America. That slave trade was something that the Founding Fathers wanted to get rid of. They wanted to get rid of the ability to purchase slaves from overseas, so that the only slave population that would be left would be whatever is in America, and of course the children born to those slaves. You remember I just said being born into slavery was one of the ways you could be a slave. But the kidnapping thing was going to stop. Now, they put a 20-year moratorium into the Constitution on any laws that would outlaw the slave trade. And that was a compromise that they made with the slave states. The slave states were basically saying, we don't want to lose the slave trade. The northern states were saying, you're going to lose the slave trade. And they compromised and said, okay, well, not for 20 years. So there's actually a provision in the Constitution that says Congress cannot pass a law outlawing the slave trade until 1808. But after 1808, they could and did outlaw the slave trade. And at that point, slavery, the slave population of America, was limited to what was actually in America. And what I find interesting about that and how that relates to this verse is that, it's almost as though the founding fathers, while not getting rid of slavery altogether, at least had it in mind to bring themselves in line with the do not steal human beings meaning of this verse. And so maybe we can count the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments as having a little bit of influence on America's progress toward eventually freeing the slaves. I'm Mike Partika, and this has been Don't Take This as Gospel. Again, if you have the resources, please, I know these are trying times, please do pick up a copy of Dennis Prager's The Rational Bible, Exodus, God, Slavery, and Freedom. And I will catch you next time. Please subscribe so you'll know when the next time is. And I will talk to you later.